Right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another RIS interview where we bring you the story behind the cutting edge research that made it into our journal, the Review of International Studies, or RIS for short. Today I'm thrilled to be talking to Henrique Tavares Furtado, who is a senior lecturer in politics and international studies at the University of the West of England. Henrique has a new article in the Review of International Studies entitled Confronting the Gated Community Towards a Decolonial Critique of Violence Beyond the Paradigm of War. Welcome to you, Henrique, and congratulations on the article.
Thanks, Juliet, and thanks to the journal as well for allowing me to explain and talk a little bit of the article in this format. I'm very happy about it.
Oh, good. That's so good to hear. So let's get straight on to it. I wanted to start by asking you about your academic journey. How did you get to this point, and how did you become interested in this area of research?
Right. So if I look back at my academic background, so for the past 10 years, I've been I've begun studying the influence and impacts of French structuralism and post-structuralism in global politics. So it's a bit of theoretically minded from the beginning. And then I sort of slowly but steadily went into a study of political violence. And at some point, these two ideas, these two fields, they sort of congregated and joined together. I looked at the memory of atrocities and how societies and individuals in general, they handle the heritage of violent pasts, and how do they represent and think about political violence in context of post-conflict, post-authoritarianism, after terrorism terrorist attacks and stuff of the sort. But I always had this sort of, well, the more I studied these issues together, the more it became clear to me that the ways in which we spoke of violence, the ways in which we discussed and analyzed the phenomenon, they recurred. They recurred again and again and again, and I was seeing just old tropes sort of revamped and reworked in a different way, even by theories and in cases where people were claiming to be doing something different and something new. But in my mind, it was just the same talk about violence again and again and again, always thinking of it as a destructive, as this sort of mechanism of elimination, always framing the notion of violence and to a certain extent death, the importance of death in global politics, in relation to the concept, the template, which I call in this article, the template of the concentration camp and the idea of genocide. So this is what sort of brought me to study the idea of how is it that we talk about violence and why it matters, which is essentially what this piece is about.
That's very interesting, the way in which you came to it. So going specifically now to the article, could you give us a brief outline of its main ideas and arguments?
Yeah. So the article is roughly divided in three steps and three moments, right? The first moment, it goes on to explain what I conceptualize as, what I identify in the literature as the main way in which a group of theorists that I call decolonial, contemporary decolonial thought, which one could argue is post-colonial, decolonial, it doesn't really matter. It's my understanding of the field currently. And then I look at the works of three main scholars, Dussel, Henrique Dussel, Nelson Maldonado-Torres, and Mbembe, who are like these big names in post-colonial, decolonial literature who really talk about violence in a more profound way. And I go on to sort of illustrate my take on their work, and I give the outlines in the first part what I call the decolonial triangle of violence, sort of sketching and the contours of what is the central theory, what are the central tropes that decolonial theorists use and utilize when they talk about violence. The second part then, in a very straightforward way, goes on to explain and emphasize what's the problem with it. It's essentially, I'm introducing the concept, I'm introducing something to the readers. Then I'm going on to say, well, it's problematic because X, Y, and Z. And in essence, what that part says is that the problem with current decolonial literature, theories of violence, with this triangle, is that it essentially doesn't do justice to the very purpose of decolonial theories, which is to try and decolonize knowledge, to move it, or sort of to break away with the shackles of past Eurocentric concepts. So in essence, what I'm arguing very simply is that the ways in which we talk about violence within decolonial theory are still very much colonized to a certain sense, meaning that they still employ a lot of the traditional Eurocentric ideas of how to conceptualize violence as a phenomenon.
So,
and sorry, I've just missed.
I was just thinking, going back to that third point, you mentioned the problems in your third part of the article, the problems with the current decolonial theories of violence. You did answer that just now, but perhaps you wanted to add a little bit more about the issues there.
Yeah, I just apologize because I missed the third and final part of the piece, which is when I actually introduced the template of the gated community as a sort of a better way and model with which we can think about violence in the contemporary world, not only as a destructive thing, not only something that separates people apart, not only something that disposes of people, not only something that is genocidal, but in essence as something that is actually very much constructive of our political and economic order as it stands. To give you a more palatable answer and an example, the sort of is part of the trajectory that led me to write this piece, which is very much influenced by the current crisis, right? I mean, when I was sitting down to write this article, and in the very beginning, the piece is outspoken about this. I thought that the current crisis, the pandemics, the ways in which lives were treated, and individuals were branded across society, it was very telling of a disjunction, of a sort of difference between our old assumptions about violence, our language to describe violence and death and how people's lives are put at risk, and how things are actually happening out there in the world right now. So the article comes as a sort of insight that this new normal that we're living, it calls for a reconceptualization of old assumptions. And just to give a quick example, when we talk about violence in the decolonial literature, in the critical literature, in global politics in general, we're still very much indebted, we're still very much fixated on concepts such as separation and segregation between individuals who are deemed as worthy and worthless. And we see death, we see mortality in the world right now across different populations as a function of their disposability, or in other ways, as a function of them being deemed as valueless to our society, as surplus, as non-essential to our society. Whereas what we've seen with the pandemics was an increased risk to the lives of individuals who were actually deemed essential to the functioning of the global economy. And I think that this really ticked something in me, inside me at some point, saying like, hold on, our contemporary world doesn't necessarily kill the people that we think are disposable, the people that we think are just rubbish or waste or don't contribute to society. It's rather the opposite. We are right now, as a society, killing the people who matter the most for the functioning of our economy. And my effort was, how can we integrate that into a theory, a decolonial theory of violence in a meaningful way? If you allow me to say just a real quick final add on to this, is, I mean, my contribution, my way of doing this was, well, maybe we should, maybe this is because we're just fixated on this idea of the concentration camp as this, the place where the undesirables of our society are pushed to be eliminated, whereas we should actually be talking more about the gated community as a model and a template that expresses the structural dynamics of the contemporary world. And what happens if we do that? And this is basically what the central argument of the piece is. It starts to unpack everything that happens once we turn the focus away from the concentration camp and the logics of warfare towards the model of the gated community as really a better model and template to explain the dynamics of violence. And then we realized that the gated community, despite what many might think, isn't necessarily a space of the segregation of the undesirable. Sure, segregation exists, but the gated community is primarily, first and foremost, a space of this forced encounter, where the homeowners are forced to live side by side with their servants, who might be whose presence might be undesirable, as it were, in a certain sense, but are still nonetheless absolutely vital for the functioning of that world. And there is a very vivid understanding amongst the homeowners. They know it, they all know it, and they say it, that should this fantasy of complete apartheid be actually enacted and the undesirables be segregated and left out, the world of convenience of the gated community would completely fall apart. So it is the sort of, I don't know, if I were to make this very simple and palatable to anyone, I'd say that I'm arguing that we should stop thinking about how we think violence works in the world out there, and we should start looking at how it actually works.
Yeah, I mean, you put that very, very nicely, and you've given us good examples there. And I at the very beginning of your article, of course, you start off with that great example of the first person who gets the forest, the cleaner, who is so indispensable, of course. You know, thank you for doing that. So I'm very aware of time, but I wanted to just finish with one last question. For those who are listening to this interview, who are very keen to know more about your research, what would you say if you could give us the main takeaways of the article?
Oof, that is a difficult question. I think that the central takeaway, I'd say, is that we need to learn how to talk about violence in ways that are not necessarily connected to destruction and warfare. Violence goes deeper than that in our society, and we won't, the less we talk about the more structuring effects of violence in the contemporary world, the less able we are to actually address them. So whereas I'm not claiming that destructive violence and genocide are not a thing, they obviously are, they exist, they happen. What I'm saying is that the best thing to understand them is to confront perhaps not the camp, but the gated community as a model for analyzing global politics, a model that is much more aware of that there isn't held hostage by old assumptions about violence, but that is more aware of how it actually operates, and to pay attention to the simple things that we're witnessing right now. The fact that those who are at risk of dying aren't undesirables, they are the essential workers of a word. And this is how theory progresses, I think, by paying attention to the simple signs that reality throws at us.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for all of this, and of course for being interviewed. It's been really interesting to get an insight into the research you've been doing. For those of you who are keen to learn more, you can read Henrique's full article on the First View section of the RIS website. If you're a BISA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership. You just need to log on to your account. And if you're not a BISA member, you might want to see if you can gain access via your institution. And while you're here, please do take a look at the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk. You can learn all about us and see all the great benefits that a BISA membership would bring you. So on that note, I wanted to thank you very much again, Henrique.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
And that's it from us. Goodbye.